Hey guys, what's going on? It's Dave with Evil Eye Games. In this video, I want to go ahead and start getting into saving game information. And originally, I had started recording this video, and I did everything, and the video ended up being like 2.5 hours long, which is a little bit long, so I'm going to end up just like breaking this down into pieces and doing it bit by bit. So in today's video, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start the process for creating our save game and implementing a way to save and recall data within the game. The first thing we're going to want to do is go into our save game files, and I'm going to go create a new blueprint class, and we're going to search for a save game, and we want to make sure it's the save game and not our settings save game, and select that. And I'm going to call this our 3P save game. So we're going to go ahead and open this guy up, and we're going to have to add the variables that we want to actually save. So I'm going to go ahead and click on a new variable, and I'm going to call this the player save location. And I'm going to make this a transform, and this variable is going to save where the player is at. Now, you can save other information about the player. In this particular case, I don't have any reason to save anything that the player has other than where they're at. The energy regenerates, their health regenerates, so there's no real variables about the player that we need to keep. Now, if you're interested in keeping something like an inventory, or you're interested in keeping ammunition counts or saving the health, one way you can do this is create a struct and then break down each of the variables within the player that you want to save. But I'm not going to need any of that, so I'm not going to go ahead and do that. The next thing we need to know is what level the player is on. So I'm going to create a new variable, and I'm going to call this the persistent level. And for the type, I'm going to go ahead and make this a name. This variable is going to store for us the persistent level that our player is in. Now, the map that I'm going to be working with is only going to have one streaming level in it. If you have an instance where you have several streaming levels and it loads up during the game, you're going to want to have a method to update the streaming level. So it would be a good idea to create another name variable here and go ahead and save what streaming level the player is currently in. You can do this by creating a collision box. So when the player enters the streaming level, you can go ahead and update the variable. Now I'm going to go ahead and create another variable, and I want to keep track of all of the enemies in the level, which ones we have killed or aren't killed. Now, you can either keep track of enemies when they get killed, or you can keep track of enemies that are alive. It's kind of easier to keep track of enemies when they're dead rather than when they're alive, so I'm going to keep a list of all the enemies in the level that have been killed. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new variable, and I'm going to call this dead enemies. And then for the type here, I'm going to set it to be a string. And I want this to be an array. So over in the right-hand side here for the variable type, I'm going to click on the grid, and I'm going to turn it into an array. Finally, I have doors that are going to be locked and unlocked throughout the course of the game. So I want to keep track of which doors are locked and which aren't. So I'm going to go ahead and I want to create a new variable, but I want to create a struct for this variable. So I'm going to go back to our main window here, and in our saved game file structs folder, I'm going to go ahead and right-click, go into blueprints, and create a new structure. And I'm going to call this locked doors struct. And we'll go ahead and open up our locked doors struct. And I'm going to go ahead and in the first variable here, I'm going to call this a name. And we're going to go ahead and make it a string. And I'm going to add a new variable. And I'm going to call this is locked. And I'm going to make this a Boolean. So it's going to contain the name of our door and it's going to contain if that door is locked. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save and close our struct. Then lastly, in our save game, we're going to have to create that struct save. So I'm going to go ahead and create a variable called locked doors. And for the type, we're going to go ahead and make it our locked doors struct. And I'm going to compile and save. And lastly, I want to go ahead and create a couple functions to get and set the variables within our save game. So I'm going to create a new function. I'm going to call this set save game variables. And then I'm also going to create a new function. I'm going to call it get save game variables. And I want these to go ahead and set and get the values from our variables list here. So in order to set them, all I'm going to do is drag these guys out to set them. And then I'm going to connect them up and then connect the inputs to the input on our function. And then I'm just going to add some reroute nodes to go ahead and make it a little bit neater. And that's going to be our set save game variables. For the get save game variables, I'm going to go ahead and add an output in here. And all we need to do is go ahead and get these variables and then plug them into our return node. And if we go ahead and compile and save, everything should be good. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of our 3P save game file. And the next thing we're going to have to deal with is where do we store these variables while the game is running. And we're going to go into our game files, and we're going to use the game state for this. And we haven't used the game state yet. We've used the game instance, and the game instance covers anything that spans the entire game. It's something that spawns when the game first starts, and it's persistent through the entirety of the game until the game is destroyed. The game state, however, is something that is created when the level loads, and it persists during the duration of that level's life. So as soon as a level is destroyed, the game state goes away. And this is good for keeping track of level-specific things or anything that happens during the course of a level. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to open up our player game state here. And we're going to need to add in the variables that we want to keep track of. So I'm going to add a new variable. And we're going to call this the player save location. And we're going to go ahead and make this a transform. I'm going to add in a persistent level. And I'm going to go ahead and make this a name. I'm going to add in a dead enemies variable. And we want to make sure that this is a string and an array. And I'm going to go ahead and add in a locked doors variable as well. And we're going to make sure this is our locked doors struct. And that it is also an array. Now, when we go ahead and start the level, we want to keep track of what persistent level we have. So this is going to be really easy to do. And all we're going to need to do is, from our event begin play here, we're going to drag out and we're going to go ahead and get the current level name. And this is going to go ahead and get the level of the persistent map that is currently open, the persistent level that is open. And we're basically just going to set our persistent level. And we can plug our return value into our set persistent level, and it will go ahead and convert from a string over to a name for us. And the reason I saved it as a name is because at some point we're going to have to do a conversion from a string to a name. It really doesn't matter where we do it, but we're going to have to do it at some point. Because when you actually call on open level, the input for this is a name. So since this input here is a name, instead of converting it when it goes into open the level, I'm just going to save it as the converted value. And so at this point, I'm just going to focus on, for this video, loading the level. So we're going to have to create a way to save the data and a way to load the data back. So in our functions here, I'm going to create a new function. I'm going to call this save game. And I'm going to create a new function as well that's going to be called load game. So first we're going to deal with our save game. And what I want to do with this is I'm going to first drag out and get a sequence. And the very first thing we want to do is check to see if a save game exists. So we're going to drag out and we're going to search for, does save game exist? And we're going to have to give it a slot name. So I'm going to call this our 3P slot name. And then I'm going to go ahead and promote this to a variable. And we'll call it our save game slot name. And then from our does save game exist, we're going to put in a branch. So if this returns that, yes, there is a save game that exists within that slot name, we're going to go ahead and load game from slot. Once again, we're going to need that slot name. So I'm just going to grab our save game slot name and plug that into our slot name. We're then going to want to go ahead and cast it to our 3P save game. And then I'm going to go ahead and promote this to a variable. And the variable is going to be our save game file. Now, if this is false and a save game does not exist within this slot, we're going to go ahead and create a save game object. And then for the class, we're going to select our 3P save game. We're going to go ahead and I'm just going to copy this up here. So we're going to cast it to our 3P save game. And then we're going to go ahead and set the save game file variable. Now, with our sequence set, we're going to go ahead and we have to set the variables within our save game. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get our save game file, and we want to call our set save game variables function that we created, and we'll connect this up to our then one pin. And we basically want to plug our variables from our game state into this set save game variables. And once we have that connected, we're going to go ahead and then save that game to a slot. So we'll drag out and we'll search for save game to slot. And we're once again going to grab that save game slot name and plug it in. And then for the object, we're going to go ahead and plug in our save game file. And then if we want to put in something for testing, we can go ahead and put in a branch afterward here. And we can plug this in. And if it's true, we can go ahead and print a string. And this is going to tell us that the game saved successfully. So I'm going to literally put that into the in string. And then I'm just going to copy this and plug it into our false. And instead of game save successfully, we'll just say game save failed. And so we're going to go ahead and compile and save. So next we're going to go ahead and go into our load game. And we're going to drag out from our load game. And we want to check, does save game exist? And you always want to check to see if the save game is there anytime you try to grab a save game. So we're going to need a slot name. So I'm going to get our save game slot name here. And we're going to go ahead and insert a branch. And if this is true, we're going to go ahead and load game from slot. And we're going to need that save game slot name again. And then we're going to go ahead and cast this to our 3P save game. And then we're going to go ahead and set our save game file. And then we're just going to call on our save game file. We're going to go ahead and get our save game variables. And then we just want to set the variables in our game state from these variables. So we'll go ahead and drag out all of the variables that we want to grab. And we'll just connect everything in. Now, if we head back to our branch here, we can go ahead and drag off from the false, and I'm just going to throw in a print string. And I'm going to put in this string here, save game file does not exist. So that way we know if we try to load something up, it's going to tell us, hey, there's no save game file there. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and compile and save this. Now we're going to need to wait to tell if the game is loading or not. And the one file that's going to be persistent over the course of the entire game is going to be our game instance. So I'm going to go ahead and open up our game instance. And I'm going to add a new variable. And it's going to be a Boolean. And I'm going to call this is game loading. And we're just going to need a function to set is game loading. And I'm going to create a second function too that is going to get is game loading. So for the set, we're simply going to go ahead and set our is game loading variable and plug the input into the input in the function. And I did this in the wrong one, so let's try that again. I'm going to go ahead and set this. And then plug the input into the input in the function. And then let's go ahead and delete this. And for the get, we're going to want to have the return. And we just want to return our is game loading variable. So we can go ahead and compile and save this. And if we go back into our game state here, if we go to our event graph, when we begin play, I'm just going to go ahead and disconnect this for the moment, and we'll drag it off to the side. And we're going to start by getting our game instance. And we're going to go ahead and cast this to our 3P game instance. And we're going to go ahead and get is game loading. And then we're going to throw in a branch and connect this up to the branch. And if the game is loading, we want to go ahead and call our load game function. And if it's false, we're going to go ahead and get the current level name and set the persistent level. And we're going to go ahead and compile and save. So now we're going to have to actually create an object to go ahead and save our game. So I'm going to go into our maps and our common objects folder, and I'm going to create a new blueprint, and it's going to be an actor type, and I'm going to call this a save game checkpoint underscore BP. And I'm going to go ahead and open up our save game checkpoint blueprint, and we're going to need to add a collision box to this. So we're going to search for a box collision, and we're going to go ahead and add it in. And I want to go ahead and just lift it up a little bit, and we're going to adjust the size on here because I want this wide enough in most areas where the character is going to walk through it. So for the scale in our Y, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn that up to 10. So it's going to be 10 meters wide. And then for the Z, I'm going to go ahead and make it 4, which will make it 4 meters high. And I want to go ahead and drag it up so it is just in a good enough position where the player is not going to have an option to avoid it. And I'm going to go ahead and turn our units of movement down so it sits about where this plane is. And I'm going to go ahead and also add another component. I'm going to add an arrow. And then I'm just going to place this arrow a little bit above the surface as well. So it's going to sit at 20 centimeters high. And this is going to be the location that we're going to save where the player is at. So I'm going to go ahead and go into our event graph here. And we have these here, which we don't particularly need. I'm going to start by selecting our box in the Components tab. And I'm going to add an event on Component Begin Overlap. And the first thing I want to do is I want to check what overlaps with our box. We want to make sure it's the player character, because if an enemy walks across one of these, we don't want them to trigger the save. So I'm going to take the other actor, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cast to our 3P player character. So if the cast is successful, I am going to go ahead and put in a do once. Now, this isn't required. But if you want this save point to only be triggered once, so if the character backtracks and you don't want it to save again, you can eliminate this do once. In this case, my levels are going to flow mostly in one direction with slight amount of backtracking, but I don't want it to go ahead and save again when the player crosses it. So the first time the player crosses it, that's the only one time I want it to trigger. Now, once we complete the do once, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to get our game state. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cast this to our 3P game state. And as our 3P game state, we're going to go ahead and set the player save location. I should have created a function in there. Let's check it out. I do not have a function to set this variable, so in our game state, I'm going to go ahead and create a new function, and I'm going to call this set player save location. And all we want this to do is set our save player location, and we'll connect the input into the input of the function, and we'll compile and save that. And back in our checkpoint, let's try this again. We're going to set player save location, and we want to call in the function. And then for the location here, you can either get the location of the player character. So if you get player character, you can go ahead and search for get actor location. And actually, you don't want the location, you want the transform. So get actor transform and select that, and then you can plug this directly into the player save location. Now, since I want this to be a one-directional type of game, I'm just going to use the arrow up here. So I'm going to drag in a reference to the arrow from our Components tab, and I'm going to get World Transform. And I'm going to go ahead and plug this into our player save location. So when the player crosses into our box, it's going to save the transform of this arrow here. And that will give us a location in the world, and it will give a rotation in which direction it's facing. And then we want to call on our game state, and we want to actually cause it to save the game. So we'll go ahead and call save game off of our 3P game state. And that's going to be it for our save game checkpoint. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and compile and save. And we can go ahead and close out of our save game checkpoint. Now, if you want to manually save the game, you can just use a menu button or a key and call on it to call this save game function. But since it is more of a one-directional progression, I'm going to just use these checkpoints to save the game as the player passes through them in the level. So I'm going to go ahead and close up these functions in our game state. And I'm going to go into one of the levels here. And I'm going to open up the persistent world. And I'm going to set it so that we're going to drop in a save game checkpoint here. The way I'm setting it up is the player is going to start over to the left here, and they're going to progress down. The door on the left over here to the player is going to be locked, and they're going to have to progress to the right to this console, activate the console to unlock that door, and then they're going to be able to continue to travel through the level. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drop a save game in here. So I'll go ahead and grab our save game checkpoint and drop one in over here. And if we have to, we can go ahead and scale it up to make sure that the player has to cross through it in order to get to the console here. Now, alternatively, and what I'll probably eventually do, is when the player activates this console, it's going to go ahead and activate a save game event. But for now, in testing, you can go ahead and insert this in just as a way of progressing. Like I can also go ahead and put one in over here to the left and rotate it around so the arrow is facing the direction of travel that the player would be moving in. And I also want to trigger the level save to occur at the beginning of play. So once the player hits a new game, they get dropped into this level. I want it to right away go ahead and create a save game. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the blueprints and open up our level blueprint. And when we begin the game here, we're casting to our game instance, we're loading the stream levels. I am loading the levels with the difficulty, so the different enemies. And then we're teleporting the player to the player start, and then changing up our HUD to the gameplay widget. So I'm just going to do a little minor rearranging here. I'm going to put the cast after we load the stream level. So I'm going to drag this guy off to the side and break this. And we're going to load the stream level first. And then I'm going to go ahead and cast our game instance. And get our difficulty and spawn the appropriate enemies. And then what I want to do is I want to drag this teleport and the change screen over here to the side. And we're going to use this 3P game instance over here. So I'm actually going to go ahead and promote this to a variable. And we'll just call it our game instance. And we can hook it up as such. Now, after we go ahead and load the streaming levels for our difficulty, we can go ahead and check to see if our game is loading. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab our game instance, and we're going to go ahead and get is game loading. And I will call on the function. And we'll plug that in line there. And we're going to put in a branch. So we're going to change up what we're going to do depending on if the game is loading or not. So I'm just going to drag this off a little bit here. So if our game is loading, we want to go ahead, and if this is true, we want to go ahead and get our game state. So I'm just going to right click and get game state, and we want to go ahead and cast this to our 3P game state and plug our true into here. And as our game state, we want to get the player save location, and we haven't set up a function for this. So in our game state, I'm going to go ahead and add a function where we get the player save location. And all we're going to do is add an output. And we're going to simply get our player save location and plug this into the output. And we can compile and save that. Then back in our level blueprints, as our 3P game state, we're going to go ahead and get the player save location. And I'm going to go ahead and promote this to a variable. And we will call it the player start location, because this is where the player is going to be starting play from when they start playing. Now, if this is false, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to take this down here, the player start get actor transform. I'm going to break links to that, and I'm going to bring it up here. And I'm going to duplicate this set player start location, and we can go ahead and plug it in so that we get the player start, get the actor transform, and then set our player start location. Then we're going to need to go ahead and teleport our actor to a location and then set the widget. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drag this off a little bit more. And from our connector over here, I'm going to go ahead and put in a sequence. And I'm going to plug our then one pin into our teleport. And we can go ahead and drag this over a little bit more. And then for the in transform, I'm just going to go ahead and plug in our player start location. So what we're doing here is when we begin play, I'm going to load the streaming level with all of the actual level content, make it visible after load. Then I'm going to go ahead and get our game instance and cast it, set a variable for our game instance. Then we're going to go ahead and get the game difficulty from our game instance. And then we're going to perform a switch. And based on whether we're easy, normal, or hard, it is going to go ahead and load the streaming level containing the easy, normal, or hard enemies. Then we're going to move into a sequence. And from our sequence, we're going to get our game instance. And we're going to get if the game is loading. If the game is loading, we're going to get our game state, cast it, get the player save location, and set it to our player start location. If we're not loading the game, we're just simply going to get the player start from the actual game level, get the actor transform, and set this to our player start location. Then from our sequence, and when we hit the then one pin, we're going to go ahead and teleport the player to our player start location. So we just grab that player start transform, break it, and plug in the location and the rotation. Then we're going to get our player controller, get the HUD, cast, and then set the current widget to our gameplay widget. So I'm just going to go ahead and compile this. And keep in mind, this is something that you're going to have to do for every level in order for this to work appropriately. So when you create new levels, yes, you're going to have to keep doing this over and over. You can also duplicate the persistent level and just go ahead and change up the variables in here. For example, the level names that load up, and change up the references for the player starts, because they're probably going to break if you duplicate it. Maybe, maybe not. I haven't done it yet, so. And that's going to take care of everything we need to do in the level blueprints. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. And so now we actually need to fix up our main menu so that it will actually load things. So we're going to go ahead into our HUD folder, and we're going to open up our main menu widget. And we have this continue game button, which we disabled. So let's go ahead and go into the graph, and let's see what we can do here. Now, I got rid of the event construct, so I'm going to go ahead and add that back in. We'll search for event construct. And from our event construct, we're going to go ahead and we want to check to see if a save game exists. So we're going to search for does save game exist? And it's going to require a slot name. Now, in order to make sure we always use the same slot name, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to get our game state, which contains a variable for that slot name. We're going to go ahead and cast it to our 3P game state. And then we're going to go ahead and get the slot name. But I want to create a function to get that. So I'm going to go back into our game state. I'm going to create a new function, and we're going to call it get save game slot name. And once again, all we're going to do for this is create a new output and get our save game slot name and plug this into the return node. And we can go ahead and compile and save this. And in our main menu widget here, we're going to go ahead and get the save game slot name. And we're going to plug the save game slot name into our slot name of the does save game exist. And we're going to put in a branch. Now, if a save game does exist, we want to go ahead and activate that continue button. So I'm going to grab a reference to our continue button. And we're going to search for set is enabled. So the event that a save game does exist, we want to go ahead and enable this continue button. And we want to check is enabled to true. And I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this and check is enabled to false and plug our false into that pin. So when we end up loading up the main menu, it's going to check, is there a save game? If it's true, we're going to go ahead and enable that button. And if it's false, we're going to disable that button. Now, when we click the continue button, when it's enabled, we want to go ahead and we want to get our game instance. And for our game instance here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to cast it to our 3P game instance. And we want to set is loading. So I'll select the function set is game loading, and we want to set it to true because we want to load the game. We then want to go ahead and actually go ahead and load up all the save game info. So we're going to need a reference to our 3P game state over here. So I'm going to go ahead and select all this and drag it over. So after we cast, I'm going to go ahead and promote this to a variable. And we're going to call this our game state. And we'll just go ahead and plug everything in. So now that we have our game state, we're going to go ahead and grab our game state, and we're going to tell it to load the game. Then, once it loads the game, it's going to go ahead and pull all the data from our save file into the game state. So we're going to pull off of our game state again, and we're going to go ahead and get the level or persistent level. Now, once again, I'm going to need a function for this. So I'm going to go back into our game state. We're going to create a new function, and we're going to call it get persistent level. And once again, we're just going to go ahead and get our persistent level and then plug it into an output. And we're going to go ahead and compile and save this. And in our main menu widget, we'll try this again. We'll get persistent level, calling on the function. And then we want to tell it to load that level. But we're also going to have to go ahead and set up the loading screen as well. And we want to do this before we actually load the level. So I'm going to go ahead and drag all of this off to the side here. So before we actually load the game and get the persistent level, we're going to go ahead and get our player controller. We're going to get our HUD. And then we're going to go ahead and cast to our HUD. And then as our 3P player HUD, we're going to set the current widget to our loading screen widget. And we can connect this into our load game over here. And I'm just going to space these out a little to kind of separate them a bit. And then finally, from our get persistent level, we want to go ahead and call on open level. And we can connect our persistent level into the level name. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and we can compile and save. And I'm going to go back to our main window, and I'm going to open up our main menu map. And we're going to go ahead and start the play. And right now, we don't have a save game, so our continue game button is grayed out. So I'm going to go ahead and hit a new game, and I'll just put it on the easy setting for now. And we're going to go have to kill this guy to get through here. And I'm going to make my way over to where that save checkpoint is. Now, if we keep our eye in the upper left-hand corner, we're going to see if it actually saves the game or not. So as we pass through here, I just passed through, and it tells us the game saved successfully. So I'm going to go ahead, and I'm going to use our pause menu to get to our main menu. And now our continue game button is active. So if we go ahead and hit continue game, our player loads up at the location where he was at. Now, he rotated pointing off to the side here because we haven't set the controller rotation. We set the character location, but since the character is set to use the controller yaw, it's going to set the character's yaw to the yaw of the controller and not the character. So one thing we're going to have to do to correct that is we're going to go back into our level and we're going to open up the blueprint. And where we set the character, where we teleport him, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to drag everything to the right here, further off to the side. And we have our get player character here. I'm going to drag off of there. Actually, we're not going to do that. We are going to use our player controller here. So I'm going to drag off of our player controller. And we want to go ahead and set rotation. And we'll have the set control rotation function. And we'll go ahead and plug this in line here. And then we have to grab the rotation from our player start location break transform rotation. We'll plug this into our new rotation. So we're just adding in here after we teleport the player character to this new location. We're just setting the control rotation before we go ahead and change our screen to the gameplay screen. So if I compile this, and we're going to save all, and we're going to load up our main menu map again. And if I hit play, we're going to hit continue game, and our character loads facing the correct direction. So far at this point, I've handled the location of the player when the level loads up again. We still have yet to go ahead and set the dead enemies and the locked doors. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to break this video up, and I'm going to do that in the next video. So that's going to complete today's video. If you have any questions or comments, you can go ahead and leave them down below. Or you can look me up on Facebook. I have a link down in the description. And message me there. And thanks for watching.